So an official welcome, everyone. This is the May session of MRBO's monthly webinar series. My name is Dana Ripper, and Ethan Duke is also here. We are with the Missouri River Bird Observatory. Our mission is the conservation of birds and really all wildlife species through science, education, and advocacy. I'm super happy to see some returning folks who have been on our webinars before, and also some new folks. And as many of you know, I'm sure we here at MRBO host a weekly webinar series in the wintertime, January through March. And we always get awesome speakers who cover a variety of ecological and conservation topics for us all. When that got done this past late March, I sent out a survey to registrants and I got a lot of responses on that survey. Thank you all for that if you were able to answer. Most folks said that they would enjoy the opportunity to attend webinars at other times of year too, probably not weekly, during the spring, summer, and fall, but monthly. So as you've probably noticed, since here you are, we are organizing monthly webinars throughout the rest of the year. We plan to host these sessions on the third Monday of each month at the usual time of 6:30. So please stay tuned on that. We will, of course, be letting you know about any upcoming webinars and their topics and speakers by email. Our speaker this evening, Loring Bullard, is a colleague of ours whom we know from water and soil conservation coalitions. We recently learned that he just published a book and was offering speaking engagements. And so we, of course, jumped on that opportunity for a webinar. Loring grew up here in the Midwest and became a self-described science geek early on after reading Rachel Carson's book, The Sea Around Us. His career centered around environmental themes, and tonight we'll be hearing about Missouri's environmental history and how Loring's experience intersected with some of the state's biggest environmental challenges. He wants us to know that while our environmental problems sometimes seem insurmountable, there are ample reasons for hope, which I'm sure is a welcome message to our webinar audience, Loring. So go ahead and take it away. The spotlight is all yours.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here this evening. It's good to see you, although I can't really see you. And you may not see me very long. If we have a big lightning strike down here, we may lose power. So I'm sorry about that if it happens. Um, I had an inspiration for this book after I retired. I retired back about 2011, and I had a plan for retirement to sit on my back deck and have a beer and enjoy life and take it easy. I planted a bunch of native plants in the backyard to make it my little secluded nook a little happier place to be and such. But it wasn't to be because I started hearing things, and a lot of the things I heard started making me angry. For one thing, I was hearing from politicians about we've got to roll back those job killing regulations. And it seemed like it didn't matter what the regulations were or why they were there or why they might be important. It was just the idea that we just don't need those. Or then those who were saying, that we don't need local control. Why have local control? The state should make all the rules. That really offended me because I spent my entire career working on local solutions to local environmental problems. So I ended up writing this book. It's called An Environmental Journey, and I'm going to talk to you about it a little bit tonight. The first title that I thought about choosing was Tree Hugger in a Cornfield. And when I talked to our publisher about that, our young editor, really, she kind of gave me this look like, well, what is a tree hugger? So I thought, well, if anybody under 40 is going to read this book and understand what it's about, maybe that isn't a good title. So I started thinking about coming of age in the environmental era because I turned 18 on the first Earth Day. I was blissfully unaware of Earth Day because, I was 18. So didn't use that one. So I ended up with this idea of the environmental journey. And really, it's kind of as was mentioned, kind of how my life intersected some of the big environmental issues in the state. And not that I had a great deal to do with solving any of these problems, but I was touched by them in some way. Starting back in the early 1960s. I was a geeky kid, science kid up in Kansas City. And at that time, we were dealing with and already had been dealing with a lot of these legacy pollutants like nuclear uh, uh, testing residues and lead mining and dioxin. I did retire in 2011. And so I want to talk a little bit tonight about what I see as kind of the big issues, the staring us in the face right now with agriculture, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. So yeah, in 1962, I was a kid living in Kansas City, and in the fall of 1962, some of you remember this. I think Doug Doty's on here. He said he remembers this very well. The Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev and Kennedy squared off. The missiles kept coming to Cuba. We had duck and cover drills at our school almost every week. I was really afraid that we were going to be in a nuclear war, and it did look very ominous. Every time I heard a siren, I looked up in the sky, half expecting to see a missile shooting overhead. But one of the problems that was already occurring by then was this idea of testing these weapons. We started in the late 40s out in the Nevada desert testing atomic weapons. We really didn't have a very good idea of what kind of negative health effects there might be from this. The military was less than a mile from some of these blasts, and they were just instructed to go home and shower afterwards. But one of the biggest problems, as it turned out, was this idea that this fallout, these particles, radiated particles that went up with the blast and then were falling to Earth, sometimes a couple thousand miles away, could lead to some problems. And in 1955 and 56, four of these radioactive clouds went over Missouri. In 1955, a scientist in Columbia, Missouri, found high levels of radioactivity in some water up there. And so there was a lot of worry about what all this fallout was going to do. One of the most worrisome things in the fallout was strontium 90, which is it's a element that's similar, chemically similar to calcium. And so it replaces calcium in bones and teeth. So you're placing a radioactive isotope in close proximity to internal organs, maybe for years, and it's a cancer causer. In 1962, our weed in the state had the second highest readings of strontium 90 in the United States, and the St. Louis milk supply showed up the highest levels of strontium 90 of 10 of the cities tested. So we knew that there was likely to be effects. Women, mothers were concerned about giving milk to their babies. Dairy farmers worried about their livelihood, etc. In the 1950s, we had Barry Commoner, who was a teacher at Washington University. He formed, along with some other people, the Committee for Nuclear Information to put information out to the public about the hazards of this atomic testing. In 1958, they started a tooth survey. Parents were asked to send their baby teeth into a central office with information about, when the tooth was lost, whether the child was breastfeeding or bottle fed, etc. And they ended up collecting over 200,000 teeth over this period. The strontium 90 in the teeth of children born between 51 and 53 was doubled. That's my age class. And it was tripled in those born between 53 and 55. So I was probably exposed to fairly high levels of strontium 90 when I was a small child. Finally, in 1963, the three nuclear powers, UK was in it by then. They agreed on a test ban treaty. Commoner called it the first victorious battle against blind assaults of modern technology. But it did not end nuclear testing. They only went underground. So briefly, another big issue in this state has been lead and lead mining. This is a shot of the old lead belt, which is over in the eastern Ozarks. where most of the lead was mined between 200 and 400 feet underground, and you had these huge leftover rocks called tailings that still have some of the lead residue in there that had to be dealt with. And in 1977, one of these tailings piles near Deloge, there was a big rainstorm in May of that year, and an estimated 120,000 cubic yards of these tailings washed right down into the big river. Uh, Subsequent floods spread those lead contaminated tailings down the river for over 30 miles, and there were warnings about eating fish out of the river. And in 2017, there was a $24 million damage assessment. Then we got the mining that's much deeper in the new lead belt, or the viburnum trend, which is 1,000 to 1,200 feet underground. And you've got these series of mines that have been developed along this old buried reef structure where the lead ore has been pushed into the pores inside the reef structure. And these are huge tailings ponds that you see in this Google Earth image. You can see these ponds from 100 miles up pretty easily. This view represents about 60 miles, equivalent to a view 60 miles up, and you can see these large white tailings ponds. That land will probably not be able to be used for anything for a long time because of the contamination in those ponds. And there's always the danger, of course, that they're going to overflow in floods and things like that. Another big problem with lead has been our smelters. There's one at Glover, and in 1970, horses that were in fields about 2 miles downwind of that smelter started falling down in the field, convulsing, trembling, and a veterinarian from the University of Missouri diagnosed them with lead poisoning. And when the EPA and others investigated, they found that there was a lot of other contaminants at those sites in addition to lead, like cadmium and thallium and arsenic, all very toxic. And in 2011, there was finally a cleanup of this smelter at Glover. And the famous one at Herculaneum, where in the late 70s and early 80s, we detected fairly high lead levels in blood of children living near the smelter. The EPA got involved in that one, of course, too, and ended up replacing the soil on 700 different properties in Herculaneum. And the final cleanup and demolition was all completed about 2017. And the third famous legacy pollutant is dioxin. And you guys probably all very familiar with Times Beach, the little town that was and isn't now. The story of dioxin really goes back to a war, like a lot of toxic chemicals do. Agent Orange was a mixture of two herbicides that was sprayed over a lot of Vietnam. It was stored in army green drums with an orange stripe. Thus, it was called Agent Orange. And the Red Cross estimates that 3 million people in Vietnam were contaminated with Agent Orange, and it led to at least 150,000 birth defects in children. So Missouri's got its own dioxin story. Back in the 60s, it was being manufactured down at Verona, Missouri, which is down southwest of Springfield, by a company called Hoffman Taff. That company ended up uh, going out of business when dioxin was banned for use in the United States finally. And it was bought by Syntex Corporation here in Springfield, and they leased a portion of their plant in Verona to a company called Napaco that made hexachlorophene, until hexachlorophene was banned in the early 70s when 13 infants in France died because of high levels of hexachlorophene in baby powder. So actually, the manufacturing of Agent Orange and hexchlorophene created dioxins that were in this heating process in these distillation units. The different compounds come off at different levels, but what's left in the bottom is this greasy, sludgy black stuff they called still bottoms, and that's where the dioxin was. So dioxin is actually an unwanted product from the distillation process itself. So in 1971, the NAPACO looked for ways to get rid of these still bottom wastes, and they were able to get Russell Bliss out of St. Louis to haul 18,500 gallons of this stuff over several trips to his storage facility in Frontenac, where he mixed it with waste oil, car oil, and used it on streets for dust control. He also used it on three horse arenas, including his own. And it did a good job of controlling the dust, but before long, the birds started falling from the rafters and the horses got sick with big sores on them. Some of the people that were working in there had nosebleeds, abdominal pains, and chloracne, which is a painful skin rash from this stuff. 60 horses eventually had to be euthanized because they were so weak, they were starving. And he also spread it at the little town of Times Beach for dust control on the 20 miles of dirt streets at Times Beach, which led to Times Beach finally becoming a hazardous waste site, a Superfund site. When EPA came in the 80s, they found 1.3 million parts per million of dioxin on the streets of the town from this waste oil, which doesn't sound like much until you consider that at the time EPA and CDC considered anything over 1 part per billion a hazard to health. So it was basically over 1,000 times more toxic than what the EPA recommended. So in the end, EPA ended up spending $33 million to relocate 800 residentials and 30 commercial properties. They built a huge incinerator at Times Beach. And in 96 and 97, they incinerated 265,000 tons of materials, not just soil, but also old carpeting and brush and everything from that town that they could run through the incinerator at a cost of $118 million total. So let's move to today. The past, we don't want to dwell on that too much, but I think, and one reason for this book is to remind us of what can happen and to make sure we don't forget. And also, maybe more importantly, to have an understanding of how we dealt with those problems. So today, it's a whole different world, of course. These are sort of what I would consider. You may not agree with me. Some of the leading challenges of today. One is agriculture. Been reading quite a few books about agriculture recently, and there's just a lot of concern about what is being done in the agricultural area. So last year, Todd Parnell and I went up to North Missouri to kind of see for ourselves some of the agricultural activities up there. We had a visit with Doug Doty, who I think is on this call, which he gave us a tour and really was helpful to help us understand what was going on. We looked at some of the CAFOs up there, and you guys all know this, but CAFOs are kind of a special problem. It's a high BOD biochemical oxygen man waste, which means once it gets in a creek or something that you're going to have likely to have a fish kill. There's of course possibility of odors at all times and noise, which something I hadn't really thought about all that much until I went up there and talked to some people that live near these facilities. And those big fans that you see on the ends of the building down here are it sounds like a jet engine 24 hours a day when they're running. And the noise of pig squealing. Pigs don't like to be slammed together that close, and so they're not happy and they're squealing, and that sound carries a long ways up there. Then you got the spills, lots and lots. Maybe not as many over the last few years as there were kind of in the earlier 90s and early 2000s. But between 1991 and 2021, the Smithville one that you see in the Google images up here, um, they had over 160. They had 164 spills with an average of 6,000 gallons per spill, with some containment structures that sometimes work and sometimes don't in terms of keeping those out of the local streams. And of course, you got this problem with these genetically similar animals are susceptible to disease, and so they're given antibiotics therapeutically, which means they're given antibiotics before they get sick, and that means that you're developing antibiotic resistant organisms inside the pigs, and those are excreted out into the environment. So if you wade in that stream and you have a cut on your leg and you get an infection from an antibiotic resistant bacteria, you may not make it out of the hospital. And then there's crop production. Alongside that, a lot in North Missouri, it's in the Corn Belt. We all know this. Pesticides kill huge numbers of pollinators. The chemical pesticides, which I've learned more about recently, one of the big drawbacks is they don't do anything to build biologically healthy soils. And we have this what's called a pesticide treadmill, where insects and weeds grow more resistant to pesticides, and then you have to change pesticides or more pesticides. And this thing about the nutrients that are reaching the Gulf of Mexico, that are causing anoxic conditions, low oxygen in the Gulf. Now 7,000 square miles, 1/10 the size of Missouri, where fish and shellfish cannot even live. And our state is responsible for 17,000 tons of phosphorus and 144,000 tons of nitrogen reaching the Gulf per year. And that's a figure is a little old. It's probably needs to be updated. But as we also know, ag is big business. $100 billion a year, 500,000 jobs. And not surprisingly, big ag is very powerful and largely dominates our state legislature. And we've seen how this plays out. In the 70s, there was concern among legislators about having foreign owned and large corporations owning and in operating farms in Missouri, especially industrial farms. And so we had a law passed in 1976. But in 93, because of Premium Standard largely wanting to expand operations into North Missouri, there was a law sort of at the final tail end of the legislative session that exempted these three counties where Todd Parnell and I visited from that farming law. And not long after that, 94, 95, 96, and then the hog farms really proliferated in North Missouri. And in 2015, we had a group of ag businesses went together to form Missouri Farmers Care with the idea to support agricultural stewardship, growth, and opportunity. Sounds good. But they also wanted counties to enroll as ag ready, which meant they would pledge to do nothing that might deter agricultural enterprises coming into their county. Then in 2016, we had a law passed that changed the makeup of the Clean Water Commission. 7 members of the commission, the original law that set it up said at least 4 members had to be from the general public and no more than 2 from industry, from agriculture or mining. So the law basically flipped that just on its head and said no more than 4 can be members of the general public, and at least 2 have to be from industry. Then Senate Bill 391, one of the ones that galls me more than anything else, this idea that we have to level the playing field in response to a patchwork of arbitrary and highly restrictive county ordinances written by non-experts. That really pisses me, because as I said earlier, I've spent my entire career working on local problems to local solutions. Or vice versa, what I said. But, it just makes sense that local people understand how to deal with their problems the best of anyone. Big Ag is really fond of portraying this as a battle to save the family farm. And of course, we all know that's just not true. But they love that image that they can put in our mind of this family farm that they're looking out for. Richard Manning wrote Against the Grain, which is pretty scathing book about all the things that Big Ag is all the problems that it's causing. But this makes a lot of sense. Big Ag profits by squeezing farmers and offloading the costs of the ecological degradation they cause on communities and the taxpayer. So true. And then in 20, just the last year, and I think there's probably some about to be introduced this year or have been maybe already, although I guess the session's about over, but they are trying to limit the damages when people sue an agribusiness. And this largely was related to Bayer and the glyphosate problem in pesticides or herbicides, um, to limit the amount of damages that can be collected by anybody. So on the good side, there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I believe it's in this idea of regenerative agriculture. And these names come and go. They get baggage, but to me, it's sort of the idea is no matter what we want to call that, we've got to build healthy soil. If we want to have good food in the future, we got to protect our soil and we got to keep it healthy. We got to keep the nutrients and soil from washing down to the Gulf of Mexico. We need to conserve water, and we really got to stop or at least cut down drastically on the use of these chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And regenerative agriculture has some really great features to it. These residues stay on the field. They help to fertilize the soil. The roots of these cover crops allow for soil water infiltration, and they can be grazed. The cover crops can be grazed part of the season. And this simulates that natural environment of like a prairie where the bison are grazing the grass in the prairie, and the waste from the bison helps fertilize the grass. It's the cycle, the ecological cycle that we want to see. My really brush with climate change has really been about rivers because I'm a water guy, and I went over to the North Fork River in May of 2017, and what you see standing out there is what's left of the bridge that used to stand over the North Fork, and it's hard to tell in this image, but that's a long drop down to the river over the edge of this thing. And this flood basically made the North Fork River into a flume, and it was called a 1,000-year event. Then in 2018, we had the second highest flood ever recorded on the James River, and that gauge at Galena has been there since 1921, so over 100 years of data. Four of the five highest floods have been in the last 16 years, and all five within the last 31 years. So in the final third of the monitoring period, all five of the highest floods ever recorded. And not only that, but NOAA and the Weather Service tell us that in the Midwest, rainfall during the four wettest days of the year has increased 35%, and the amount of water flowing in streams during the biggest floods has increased 20%. So we're getting more intense storms, bigger floods more often. Well, there's not time really to go into in a lot of detail about all the effects of climate change, but for the watershed guy like me, this more floods and warmer water is affecting lots and lots of organisms in lots of ways, spawning, nesting, temperature sensitive species like this hellbender. The hellbender breathes through its skin, and if uh, cold water holds more oxygen, so if the water warms just a few degrees, it's likely that the hellbenders won't be able to get enough oxygen, and that may be the end of our hellbenders. Um, Scientists at some universities, and these numbers are kind of all over the board, but some of them that I've seen recently say that we're likely to lose at least a quarter of our species on the planet under even a moderate warming scenario. One of the biggest problems really is this idea of the uncoupling of ecological relationships. And the easiest way to think about this is the flower blooms before the pollinator arrives. Um, but there's all kinds of other ecosystems out there, from flooding protection, firewalls against the spread of disease, medicines made from natural ingredients, and all of this stuff. These ecosystem services have been valued at something like $50 trillion a year worldwide. So it's not a small thing. The only real answer is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've just got to do it. You see these schemes of carbon sequestration and putting it underground, and plans to make it into carbon dioxide gas and reuse it industrial. All these things is fine. It's good to be looking at that, but it can't be an excuse for not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We simply have to do that. And now we talk more about, that things are going to change, and we look at adaptation and resilience. Things like, where we're growing, trying to grow corn or something, maybe we end up with having to grow native grasses, which are more drought resistant. They have deeper roots, so they're able to tolerate, hotter conditions, and they also have an advantage of storing more carbon. And prescribed fires, which are being used now, with great results in not only prairies, but also in savannas and other places too. And probably one of the things that we all can do, and this is what kind of has given me some hope, is that there's, I think, a lot more interest in that, and that is backyard biodiversity. What can we do in our own backyards to help save the world? And, there are things we can do, and we should do, and we really must do. If you haven't read some of Doug Tallamy's stuff, I'd highly recommend it. A couple of his books have been really eye-opening to me. I love his ideas and his statements like these. All places have ecological significance, not just the few places we have not yet destroyed. There's a view that, we just need more preserves, we need more national, parks or whatever, and that's going to take care of a problem. It won't work. We'll never have enough. We have to think about stewardship on all lands. We no longer have the right to ignore the stewardship responsibilities attached to land ownership. Amen. I mean, we all have to be good stewards of our land. And it is our efforts as individuals that will determine whether, as a society, we succeed or fail, which to me is one reason for hope, because I think more people are starting to maybe understand that. So wrapping up, just, kind of throwing a few ideas out there in terms of thoughts and lessons, maybe from my experiences from the 60s and beyond. And I think, like I said earlier, one of the things is to remember, not forget the past, not forget what's happened. And maybe there are even some lessons from the 1960s that we could learn. I think about the first Earth Day, 1970. It was environmentalists largely and people concerned about the environment that came together. But that's not what maybe turned the tide. It was because they joined forces with and were allied with groups who were worried about civil rights and what was going on with the Vietnam War and the civil rights. So, it wasn't just environmentalists. It's when people start banding together with common cause that we can finally make some significant change. And we ended up with 20 million people taking part in the first Earth Day. That's 10% of the United States population took part in the first Earth Day. Now, yeah, lots of new threats. This one that's hanging over us right now, this dismantling of government functions, including public health and environmental protections. It's horrible. And along with it, civil rights and human rights abuses. And one of the ones that sticks in my craw the worst of all, this local control issue. So, environmentalists, we're not alone here. Uh, we need to find allies and get ourselves lined up with common cause, with people in the public health field, with human rights field, and others who are all worried about these threats, and to the extent we can, try to speak with one voice. Somehow, we've just got to uncouple the environment from politics. It should not be a political issue. It's a human issue. And I've also learned that, especially when I hear people say we got to roll back regulations, what really bothers me about this is that good laws are necessary and they work. We've got to have them. There are always people that are not going to follow the rules. We've got to have good laws. Now, maybe some of the regulations can be tweaked, some of them maybe can be even eliminated, but you don't go about it in terms of just a universal rollback of regulations. And I don't love to hear this, and I don't want to hear this. So one thing I think as environmentalists that we need to do, we kind of have a reputation as doomsday prophets, and I think we need to try to speak more often and more forcefully about what we're for rather than what we're against. And in my mind, I have a couple of prongs that I come at this from. One is this idea of Talamis of bringing nature home, of trying to convince homeowners and landowners that it's in their best interests and they will be happier and healthier if they will pay attention to the stewardship needs of their own land and their own property. You know, Doug Tallamy suggests that if we could get half of the urban areas in by 2060 in a more ecological condition, that we would have more land protected that way than in all the national parks in the United States combined, and grasslands and monuments. And so he promotes this idea that this diverse group of properties could be called a homegrown national park. And there's hopeful signs, at least around Springfield, and elsewhere too. The North National Wildlife Federation survey shows that 1 in 4 homeowners now use native plants to attract wildlife. And in Springfield, the native plant zones are booked. You can't hardly even get in there anymore. People are so falling all over themselves trying to get all these native plants. So I hope that means there's a lot of people planting natives out in their yard. And there are good things going in terms of ecologically sustainable food production. About 10% of Missouri croplands now use cover crops. Of course, that doesn't mean they're not using herbicides and stuff too. They may be. And the USDA has just started. I'm on the board of Ozark Land Trust, and we're just now starting to get more USDA funded conservation easements to protect farmland, and I think that's a hopeful sign. Resource professionals, I think, have a stronger collaborative ethic. I heard this from several people I've talked to, that agency people realize they got to work together. They can't do it alone. There's going to have to be a real synthesis of people and ideas to get things done. We've seen at Ozark Land Trust an increase just over the last several years, really, in the number of landowners that want to see their land permanently protected somehow. Um, and I think that by and large, resource managers now have more of an ecological mindset than they maybe did certainly in the 70s and probably even in the 80s and 90s. And we're starting to see books, quite a few books from farmers who are using regenerative methods and making a decent living at the same time. So that's what would sell it. It would help if the USDA would really get on board with regenerative program, cost share programs, and put funding in the farm bill for regenerative ag and things like that too. So I'll wrap up with this slide because I really like this quote from John Muir. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made to me. Most people are on the earth, not in it. And I think that one of our biggest jobs today is to try to gently guide people back into the earth to help them reestablish their natural roots. Because I think everybody is an environmentalist, everybody's a conservationist to some extent. Some of us more than others, but I think we have to cultivate that idea that down inside people they want to have a healthy life. They want their kids to be healthy, and so they need to pay some attention to what's going on around them. So with that, I'm going to just stop. This little QR code down here is where you can order the book if you want to take a picture of that. There's my email. Feel free to email me anytime. My book, The Environmental Journey, is published by the University of Missouri State University, and it's available through their Ozark Studies Institute. You can also order, if you want to, these two books, The Living Waters, The Springs of Missouri, and Saving Bull Creek, which is about this beautiful stream that I like to float down south of here. So with that, I'm done. Dana and Ethan, and if you guys want if there's any questions or anything I can do to make sure I don't get blown away in the storm. It's starting to really blow out here in front of my front yard.
Loring, we're glad you're still with us. We can actually hear the thunder, I think.
Yeah, it's looking pretty grim outside.
Thank you. That was seriously, that was wonderful. And I'm very moved. And that was, I think, some stuff that a lot of us needed to hear right now. We do have questions. If you're the kind of the master question curator there, so if you want to.
Yes, as always, there was good comments from folks in there too that we'll be able to share with Loring afterwards as well. But there's only a few questions, so it should be pretty easy to tackle. The first one comes from Jack, and it says, Is it still advisable not to consume fish from the big, and I'm assuming muddy,
The big river, probably.
the big? I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure. I'm not sure if that health advisory is still on. The conservation department, I believe, puts out those advisories, and I think it's conservation department, not
I think it was
DNR, but
the Department of Health and Human Services, I think
maybe it's
was.
Department of Health. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're probably right. And so the health advisors that used to be on were eating fatty fish, red horse suckers, stuff like that. But I really don't know, Ethan, if that is still in effect or not. There's been quite a bit of cleanup activity there. So it may be that they have finally been able to remove at least some segments of that river from those health advisors.
Well,
Loring,
I dropped a
oops,
link
sorry.
there in the chat of the health the Department of Health and Human Services Living Environment Fish Advisory. So that should be a good resource to look at that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Dana, I'm sorry.
Oh, just I was about to drop the same thing in the chat. That's all.
Great minds.
That's all.
Uh, Jack had another question here. Is the work of Riceline Energy is doing with pig manure to energy helpful or hurtful?
This is a
Well,
great question.
that is a great question, and I'm gonna preface my answer by saying I'm thinking about doing a book on regenerative agriculture because there are a lot of questions out there about CAFOs and what we should do or what's the best path forward, et cetera. And as we all know, really, as long as we're eating meat and eating pigs, there's going to be probably going to be CAFOs. But I don't know much about the biogas uh, part of it. I think there are people in the CAFO work group that are up to that, up to date on that a lot more than I would be. Jeannie Heuser, she may be on this call, and the folks in the CAFO work group. I think can keep up with the literature. I know Cheryl Markham does down here in this part of the state, and so there are other people that probably have a better fix on that. I mean, it's they're capturing gas for odor control, on those big lagoons and things. So I know that's part of the idea. I mean, that was part of a consent decree years ago that the odor they had to do something about the odors on those. So it's not a very satisfactory answer, but I just should say I really don't know. I mean, I can see that there's some real downsides to producing that biogas.
Well, I would encourage folks to check out our webinar that we had with Dr. Chris Jones on his book, The Swine Republic, and it really gets into the issues involved at scale. And it's one of those things where I was at a waste control conference a year or so ago, and some people presented on the topic of this, capturing energy from decomposition in general. And this CAFO thing was just one way of doing that. And by
Sure.
those experts, it wasn't really economically viable. But then
Yeah.
again, you're just going to be burning more greenhouse gases anyways, and methane isn't really the best thing out there.
Yeah, yeah, that's
So
right. Yeah, we were supposed to meet up with Chris Jones up there on the trip to North Missouri. I really wanted to meet him and talk to him, and I mean, I've met him before, but I wanted to meet him up there and take a look at some of the CAFOs in southern Iowa there. But he had to be at the state legislature that day, so we didn't get to meet with
Getting you two together would be dangerous.
That's probably a good place for Chris Jones to be, though, is the
Yeah.
Iowa State Legislature.
him.
Jack, I just want to comment to Jack Hambian for that question. That I mean, that's a really, really critical question at this point, and there's a lot, as Loring just said, to the topic. I mean, I think the question is like, as you just said, Loring, like if it does rest foundationally on accepting CAFOs to begin with, right? And then it's kind of like, if we have to have these things, what is the best way to manage the waste? And I just want to put out there that I think one of the things that is seldom talked about is all the inputs that go into CAFOs, right? Like the methane gas biodigesters and capture is an attempt to address the outputs, and we still have an input problem as well. But anyways, moving on. I just that was a great question, Jack.
It is, and I'd rather see animals on the land. I mean, that's sort of returning to the ecosystem model of food production, where the animals are on the land, the animals eat the plants, then you produce the meat, and it's like trying to industrial farming has just got some real problems at its very roots, so to speak.
Fair enough. Could you talk about the Ozark Land Trust for those of us who want to ensure our land is conserved beyond our lifetimes by J.L. Johnson? So you reference Ozark Land Trust and
Yeah, it's a land trust organization that's been in existence for I think since the 70s, so it's been around a while. So the idea is to develop. The idea is land protection, but you are trying to get landowners to enroll their land in some type of permanent protection, usually a conservation easement, and these are becoming used a lot more because um, you know kind of going back to the farm bill, where you have money set aside that helps a farmer put in a better practice of some sort. And there's a contract period, and the farmer is required to keep that practice in effect and working through the contract period. But at the end of the contract period, if he wants to tear it out, dig it up, or plant something else, he's welcome to do that. So, you know, what the point to me is of this is that we've got to get more land permanently protected. This idea that we go in and do some practices and improve things for the short term, and then and then the next owner comes along and does something different. Um, we when we make a gain, when we make a conservation gain, we can't afford to lose it. And so Ozark Land Trust and Ozark Greenways in Springfield here does too, has agreements with landowners to put land in permanent protection. There are rules that are in the agreement about what can or can't happen with the land, and it all is worked out with the landowner. And in the case of Ozark Land Trust, the key factor is the landowner pays into a stewardship fund up front. There are some tax advantages to conservation easements, but it's usually not enough to offset the costs of it. And especially one of the big costs is the monitoring, because someone has to make sure the agreement is adhered to in perpetuity. So there has to be a well-established organization that takes that responsibility. And so this stewardship fund is an upfront payment to help make sure that the monitoring continues. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer, but the key is permanent protection and a group that takes the burden of making sure that the next landowner doesn't come in there and cut all the trees down or bulldoze it or whatever. So that's kind of the theory of it. An owner can put a conservation easement on just part of their land and then develop the rest of the land any way they want. They could do a buffer along a stream. So it's not always the whole parcel. It can be just, a sensitive part of the area. Maybe it's an old growth forest, or maybe it's a cave, or maybe it's a stream, something like that.
A great project of longevity and stewardship that deserves a long-winded answer, I think. Uh, um, Doug Doty chimes in to say, uh, thought regarding ag industry rhetoric. Agriculture laments the loss of farmland to urban sprawl, solar projects, excessive regulation, but glosses over soil erosion, nutrient pollution originated by agriculture. It's past time for agriculture to address this.
Well, amen to you, Doug.
Doug
I agree.
Dowdy, that was a comment, not a question.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree wholeheartedly. I've had this um, well, I've had two points made against me when I was working for the watershed committee. One was that urban people just don't understand ag. They don't really know how it works, and so they have no business trying to tell ag what they can or can't do. You know, and this other thing is like, we're the jobs. So, anything you try to do that's going to interfere with agriculture, you're just hurting our economy and our job deal. And the third thing is, and I'll say this out loud because I was so pissed off one time, I was about ready to belt somebody, but the Missouri Farm Bureau, back when we were trying to get a special overlay around drinking water reservoirs that would require CAFOs of a smaller size to be permitted by DNR. All it was going to do is reduce that down to 300 animal units, and if it was going to be in the drinking water reservoir. And Farm Bureau put out this big thing about, that here they go again. The next thing they're going to do is this. This is getting the foot in the door. The environmentalists are going to come and they're going to take, blah, 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 blah. So, that's their tactic, is scare tactics, that, we're going to take something away that they can't live without, or that we don't understand what we're doing, talking about. And then this idea that big ag, is the providing all these jobs up here. So anything you might say against that is hurting local people.
Yep. Well, I guess, Doug, you got some agreement there. Uh, Brenda Perculis asks, short of doing all the things that Ptolemy recommends for our backyards to hype local ecosystem, what else could or should we be doing, especially in these times? I think that's a good question. What else should we be doing?
Well, one hard lesson I've learned is what happens if you don't stay involved in the political process. Um, you know, uh, I think I think most politicians are open to common sense solutions to problems. And before the rhetoric starts, heating up so much, it's a good idea to get to know the politicians and come forward with reasonable ideas, that they can maybe sell. I think, there's been a few here locally that we've made some pretty good inroads with, and so I I think if we're environmentalists, we just have to stay tuned in to the political process. I used to want to just steer clear of it. I mean, my idea was, I don't want to have anything to do with it, but Neil Compton, who was the organizer of the Ozark Society back in 1962 down in Arkansas, they were fighting two dams, Corps of Engineers dams, proposed on the Buffalo River. And he got a bunch of people together down in the Fayetteville, Springdale area and formed the Ozark Society. And they started talking about what they could do. And they had several people who were saying, like, we have to get political. And others were saying, like, no, we need to, walk this line. We got to play both sides. We got to, be careful about what we say and who we say it to. Neil Compton famously said, if we don't get political, we won't save the buffalo. And he was right. They got the governor and senator to go on a float trip on the buffalo, and they went and visited their representatives in Washington D.C. I mean, they did all those things, and that made the difference back then. I mean, that was the big difference. The last time the buffalo was saved from the hog farm, C&O hog farm down there, really, I think it was the social media that played the big role, because if I remember right, there was over 20,000 people that chimed in about protecting the buffalo. So now we've got social media. If it could be harnessed somehow for good instead of evil, you know, that's a big force too.
Awesome.
Oh, I didn't even answer the first question, did I? About what else you can do?
Yeah.
Politics, I guess I did a little bit, but
You did. Yeah.
the other thing I think is to support environmental organizations like MRBO and, really step up the support, because, they're all struggling. And, we need to just put our money where our mouth is. I mean, I'm, I'm in pretty good shape. I mean, I'm not rich, but, I certainly feel like I have the capacity to support environmental organizations that are doing the things I want them to do.
Wow. Thank you. Steve Olson says, powerful presentation, Loring Bullard. Thank you. Right on, Steve. Do you think there is any chance of mandating riparian corridors in Missouri? What a great question, considering carbon sequestration and all that. Bottomland forests are the best at that. But
Well, I always said riparian corridors are the first and last line of defense in our watershed. Their importance cannot be overstated. Biological, structural, all those things. And so, if we want clean water, we got to have good corridors. I mean, it just pretty much boils down to that. So, I would like to see that. I just don't, at a state level, you know. I write in my book about the Natural Streams Act. I don't know if any of you guys remember much about that. I lived through that experience, and there were some good ideas in there. This idea of making a watershed plan. Let's get our citizens together and make a watershed plan in these river basins. Um, but it turned out, I guess, it was just too much, too soon. And so I don't know that the riparian corridor thing, we have it in Springfield. I mean, there's now a riparian corridor ordinance, that protects corridors from development and stuff in Springfield, and I think St. Louis has some too. So it's more of an urban thing. But and this is kind of off that subject, but this thing about local control, I really, and I've talked to Dan Childs and some other people about this, about the idea of potentially an initiative petition that could renew the idea of local control. And the reason I say that is not just because I work in a county where we've been tried to be forthright about protecting the environment. But I think that, taking that tool away from other counties or municipalities that want it is wrong, like Cedar County and Montauk County or wherever. If a county or a city wants to have the power to control their own destiny, their own environmental destiny, they should be able to do that. So, the idea that somebody in Jeff City can tell me here in Springfield that my rules are not necessary, or they're not good enough, or they're too much, or whatever is just wrong in my mind. So I don't know if there's any chance of that, but I think people in Missouri largely would understand the reasoning behind it, that that the idea that local people have the best handle on what's going on. And so why take away that power that they might have to take care of their own problems? I just can't help but think maybe an initiative petition kind of based on that one thing could go, and that way the counties or municipalities that wanted to use those tools could. Now, a lot of the counties sign up for Missouri Farmers Care. They've already signed that book saying, hey, we're not going to do anything. Well, yeah, okay. I mean, you get what you get now, but if you got a county that's really fighting that and really wants to address those issues, why take away their ability to do that?
Excellent. Um, uh, People are trying to chime in here and keep on bringing it along. It's up to you
I'm
if you
talking
want.
too much. I'm sorry.
No, it's up to you if you want to keep going on.
We have a couple of
No,
comments in the Q&A. Um,
go ahead.
Susan Ferris says, great idea about an initiative petition. The Missouri Farm Bureau is not opposed to local ordinances regarding solar farms and wind farms. I don't, if they follow the federal lead, they might end up being that though. And then Kirk asks, is there anyone producing studies that attempt to show that environmental policies are economically beneficial and that they aren't job killers?
Um, I've seen them in the past. Some cities have done studies like that. I'm trying to think. It seems like somewhere in Michigan, I saw one not too awful long ago. But yeah, there have been um, uh, uh, things that show that environmental regulations do not hurt the local economy. That and largely, Springfield right now, we just went through a big planning process, a 20-year planning process, and you know, the thing that people are really looking for, especially younger people now, are quality of life. And so when you have a city that takes care of its environment, people want to live there and businesses want to locate there. It's been shown time and time again, and there probably are numbers out there that you could find. I don't know off the top of my head where you would go to find those, but I'm sure there have been a lot of studies that relate, economic growth, quality of life, and environment. And so, it's intuitive, that people want to live someplace where it's clean and nice, you know. The sad thing to me is that to some extent, what we've kind of gotten used to the idea of in this country is sacrificial zones, where southwestern Kansas, Garden City, is full of feedlots, and you can't even eat at a restaurant there in Garden City without getting sick at your stomach. And it's kind of like, well, but nobody plans on going on vacation in Western Kansas anyway. You're just going through, unless you're going to the grasslands, which are nice. I'm okay with that. But it's sort of a mindset that we can just sort of destroy these places because they're not of any great value to anybody. And I'm afraid, in some ways, and I know that my friend up in Iowa would hate for me to say this, but it's kind of what is happening in Iowa. It's kind of becoming a sacrificial zone, for CAFOs and big ag.
And the highest
And
raising cancer rate in the country.
yeah, and all these other problems that go along with that. And so, I don't know. There's just not a big there's just not a big rebellion like there ought to be, you know, because we can't afford to sacrifice any place. You know, we can't.
Cheryl Markham ties in just to say, Brenda, I encourage you to buy your meat, chicken, and beef and pork from local farms. That's a great idea. I live in Cedar County and buy all my meat from Landers Lean Meat in Dade County. I have to think ahead and buy what I need ahead of time when the farmer uh, butchers. I love never buying meat in styrofoam trays with those nasty little diapers that absorb the liquids.
Those are nasty. Yeah, Cheryl, thank you. I mean, that's a great point, and you know, we're seeing more of those pop up too, and that's one reason I am interested in this idea of regenerative agriculture, because I think that it's not too, it shouldn't be too hard to convince people that locally raised beef is better for them, it tastes better, and it's better for the environment. You know, really, I think most people could be sold on that. You know, it's just that the deck is stacked against them because, you know, corporate ag holds all the you know, all most of the cards, and you know, so it's hard to break into that. But if we can get some stuff in the farm bill to help promote that, and you know, kind of cut back on the commodity subsidies and things that are, you know, I mean, look at what's going on right now with soybeans, you know, going to China. You know, when you think about it, you know, a huge portion of our Midwestern United States is dedicated to growing soybeans that are going to be going to China. You know, so we're left with what's coming off the fields, and everything is going in our rivers. And you know, all the produce and the meat, or the soybeans and stuff, are going somewhere else. So you know, it's almost like, how can you, how can, and we have people starving in America at the same time. So why don't we grow our food for us here? Why don't we? Why don't we grow our food that we need for us in the United States here, and export furniture or toys or something else to other countries? You know, or maybe send food to countries that really need it. 85% of our food goes to the 20 most highly developed countries in the world, and less than 10% of our food goes to the nations that really have big hunger problems. And yet you hear people like our Governor Parsons saying, when the Senate Bill 391, you know, passed, like, now Missouri farmers can feed the world. It's like, well, yeah, but we don't feed the world. We feed some people. But you know, I hate to even go off on these tangents, because people are probably going to be email me now going like, you know, you're a lunatic. But I just think that we need to eat food that we produce ourselves here close, and the closer to home, the better.
Dana, what do you think?
But I still like bananas, so I don't know what we're going to do about that.
Well,
The food import, export, and waste, and us not growing food that we eat is a big part of problems. I would like to recommend the documentary The Grab to people. If you're a member of the Missouri Rural Crisis Center, you might have seen it a couple months ago when they did a free screening, but just called The Grab. It's about predatory food policy by nations across the world. And it's sincerely terrifying. But it really, like, it really dramatically underscores a lot of what you just said, Loring.
gonna pick one out of there, Dana.
I
I'll probably
mean,
warn everybody out.
I mean, I'm seeing lots of comments, but we should probably let Loring get on with his evening. And we can send him the good comments in the chat.
Yep. Uh,
Becky did make a comment about prairie strips in ag fields, which absorb and buffer nutrients and runoffs. That's a good program. Um,
And I think Doug Doty is using those, if I remember
Yes,
right.
he is.
He
Yeah.
is. He's also doing whole field prairie restoration as well, which is really very biodiverse.
I, I guess I'd like to just jump in and just give a PSA. Next Thursday, the 29th, if you're in Southwest Missouri, there's a public hearing hosted by the DNR down there. You can find it on their website, for taking public comment on the expansion of poultry CAFOs down there. They're adding 9 new ones down there. So they already have 9 million broiler chickens in the spring watershed, the Huck 8 down there. And they want to add additional almost 2 million. So just to give you an idea of those outputs, that's an additional 2 million, or 1.4 million pounds of nitrogen, 1 million pounds of phosphorus, and another uh, uh, almost 1 million pounds of potassium every year in that one watershed. So if you're in that geography, you might want to tune into that one.
I just put the link in the chat
Thanks.
so people could see it. It is an in-person only.
Yep.
But yeah, Pierce City, Missouri, 4:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. next Thursday, or Thursday the 29th, sorry.
Well, that was just an outstanding presentation. I found it really inspiring, and it's a daunting time and a daunting world, but that's just what we needed, I think. That was a great perspective.
Mm.
Well, I appreciate that. It's uh, start after retirement, you start thinking. I had visions of myself kind of spending my time reminiscing about the past, but I find myself thinking more about the future all the time. you know, because I've got kids and grandkids. And so I think that's one thing that we need more people thinking about, because I think if you care about the future, you will have to be an environmentalist.
Mhm.
Thank you guys for all the good questions and your attention. I guess you were paying attention. I can't tell from here. You may have been off doing something
There's
else,
been a lot
but
of emojis and
But yeah,
comments.
based on chat and emojis, I think we've got attention paid. Oh, hey, I've never seen that one before. That was nice. The heart, the hands carrying the heart. That was a nice one. Well, thanks
Thanks,
everyone. And
everybody.
Loring, hopefully we will see you in Southwest Missouri quite soon.
okay. Well, I hope you guys can make it down. And also, I just want to very briefly say that I am also looking for our opportunities to speak in maybe St. Louis, Kansas City, and Columbia. If people know of groups that might be interested up there, um, I just decided that I need to kind of take it on the road, maybe, because this is sort of my commitment to trying to be an environmentalist. and so if anybody knows of a group, or I don't want to do a whole lot of them, but maybe if there's a few in those cities that people know people up there that might be interested in a program. And it doesn't have to be an environmental group; it could be a Rotary or something else too. In fact, I like kind of testing my message on folks that aren't really consider themselves environmentalists, because like I said, my hope is that all of us are to some extent.
Yeah, I don't know everyone on here, of course, Loring, but the folks on here tonight seem to be from a pretty wide geography. I know at least we have one organizer from the Kansas City chapter of Master Naturalists is on
Okay,
here. And then,
and my email's on
people,
there. Yeah.
yeah, so that's perfect. And if anyone didn't catch Loring's email Ethan or I, and we will connect you. But yeah, sounds
Okay.
good.
All right, Dana. Well, thanks for setting
All
this up.
right.
I sure appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, sir. And yeah, hopefully we will see you soon.
Okay. All right.
All right. Good night,
Have a good
everybody.
evening. Good night.